Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, as the governor and the legislature work to rescue the state from a deep fiscal hole, there's new information about how the state fell so far and who is most responsible. We'll take a look tonight at the wounds from the past and the efforts to recover. We'll also hear the latest of Tom Benson versus his family, and we'll discuss Uber's impact on the market. We'll begin, though, looking at this week's tornado activity. And a little later, we'll reflect on the career of meteorologist Bob Breck, who is retiring next week. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Clancy Dubos, political editor, Gambit Weekly. Katherine Sayre, reporter, NOLA.com, the Times-Picayune. And Bob Breck, meteorologist, WVUE-TV, Channel 8. And Mother Nature has given you a great send-off. I mean, what amazing weather we had this week.
Wow, wasn't that something? I mean, we were thinking about, this is 38 years here, and never, and in my memory, do I remember having that many with that kind of intensity. So it was kind of unprecedented, although our history is pretty small. It hadn't happened in 38 years, and it turns out from what the Weather Service is saying in modern records, we have never had it in the New Orleans area. Now, other parts of our state have had bad tornadoes, but to have these kind of storms, and so many of them, all in one day. Wow.
Right. And to have just this series almost like moving along in a line. That's something that, folks from here, you see movies about having several tornadoes happening all at once in one day. It's like, no, that really can't happen. It indeed can, and we found out.
Well, normally it happens farther up north. It's not unusual to have these, they're called tornado outbreaks, Marcia. It's kind of like the weather gets all of its right ingredients together, and they're called outbreaks, where you not just get one or two, you might get a dozen, or sometimes, like back in 1974, there were 150 in one day.
Whoa.
Can you imagine that? So it's not that the outbreaks are unprecedented, it's the location. And it was, fortunately, we don't see those too often.
And I hope that we're not going to continue to see them. I mean, is this, do you think, going to be a trend? Are we in some sort of climate trend?
No. No, and I'll tell you why. We are in an El Nino year. We were supposed to be stormy this winter, and frankly, we haven't been. So this is not a surprise that we had some very active weather in an El Nino year. Next year, probably back to what's called a La Nina. And all you need to know is when the El Ninos happen, and they come about every 8 to 10 years, normally they prevent hurricanes because they increase wind shear over the tropics, but that same wind shear is one of the key ingredients in developing severe weather. It's kind of like the old fireplace. You have to have the flue opened at the top when you have all the air coming together at the bottom. Mm-hmm. If the flue's closed, you're not going to have the storms develop as much. So when you have El Nino going, not that we can guarantee there's going to be severe weather, but it's not surprising that we had that kind of outbreak.
But when there's a hurricane, I mean, we know perhaps days ahead with the tractors and things are more predictable. To what point are tornadoes predictable? I mean, do we know an hour or so before, or do we just...
Well, that is a good question here, Errol, because what happened this time is the Storm Prediction Center, and these guys are good. I mean, they came out 2 days in advance and had us in kind of this bullseye that heads up, pay attention, and then the day before, they come out with this, what's called PDS. It's a particularly dangerous situation, and translation is, it's going to happen. Anytime I see that, it's gonna happen. So we knew the day before that southeast Louisiana was gonna have severe weather. So it's not like a hurricane where the thing is off of Cuba. We know it's coming 2-3 days ahead of time. This gave us plenty of advance notice. The people in Convent and Laplace, they did have some notice, but the thing with the tornado, you don't get that advance lead warning of days, it's usually minutes.
And so the watch versus the warning, explain the difference between those. When you tell us you're under tornado watch as opposed to a warning.
As someone in the business, I feel the watch is actually more important because it's telling you to pay attention. Whereas by the time the warnings come out with our kind of tornadoes, there's not much lead time. And usually when the warning comes out, it's you don't have time to react. If you're up in Kansas and Oklahoma, up farther north where they have these long track storms, and they can give you maybe 20, 30 minutes lead time. We don't get that here. So I say the watch actually is the more important one, because that's when you should be already in your mind having your plan. What do I do with the kids if I start hearing that freight train? Where am I going to go? Where's my safe room? But that's just my opinion. They'll always say the warning's more important, but I think the watch is equally as important.
Why do you think that these always seem to hit less populated or more rural areas and like never downtown?
Or trailer parks.
Yeah,
it seems like they've always hit in the mobile homes.
Yeah.
And I think what happens is these winds will affect a mobile home far worse than a regular well-constructed brick house. So you see the brick, although in this case it hit some brick houses too.
In Laplace, yeah.
But it doesn't take much to tip over the mobile home. And when a mobile home gets tumbled, it doesn't stay together. It falls apart. And so that's why you see the damage seemingly so more spread out over a big area. It's because the mobile home is not as solidly constructed or anchored down. The RVs weren't anchored down at all.
And that was an F3 from what we have in Convent.
Which is really strong for southeast Louisiana. Yeah. Even there was a couple of F2s. So this was a unusually strong outbreak for us.
Bottom line, pay attention when we're under tornado watch. You guys mean it.
Absolutely. We try and give you a day's notice that tomorrow could be one of those days. And fortunately, that kind of notice doesn't affect us that often, but it happens.
Okay, Bob, thanks a lot. We're going to be talking to you in a little bit more later on about your future plans. Going to go over to Clancy right now, talking about a storm of a different sort, and that is our budget crisis, our budget mess. There were some harsh words for our former governor about this crisis.
Yes, and Newell Norman he actually sort of apologized, not to Bobby Jindal, but to the audience. He said, look, I think his exact words were something like, I voted for that idiot, or I supported that idiot. But he just unloaded on former Governor Bobby Jindal. And while you might quibble with how harsh he was, the criticism was on point. Any governor, whether it's Bobby Jindal or somebody else in Louisiana, the governor's office, the administration, controls the flow of information. And what Bobby Jindal apparently did, and I think the evidence is pretty conclusive here, they either lied or they suppressed accurate information. So when people say to John Bell Edwards, the current governor, who was a member of the legislature, or to any other member of the legislature who was around for the last 4 or 8 years, well, you were there, how could you not know? Well, they wouldn't know because Bobby Jindal's team lied and or suppressed the accurate information.
And this was regarding exactly what? What information are you talking about?
About the extent and the nature of Louisiana's fiscal crisis, the undercollection of taxes, the impact of the corporate welfare, as Bobby Jindal himself used that term. Louisiana gives away more in corporate tax incentives than we collect in corporate income taxes. That's totally upside down. That shouldn't be anywhere near like that.
And reports were supposed to have been filed and were
there
not.
Were reports that the legislative auditor issued an annual report. There's an act of the legislature that requires the auditor to file basically a summary report of all of the office's reports for the prior year, but particularly with an eye toward the fiscal impact. And in his annual report that came out either late January or early February, the auditor, in just one little paragraph on page 17, said, okay, we had in certain departments, it was Department of Revenue, Department of the Culture and Tourism, in the Lieutenant Governor's office, and one other department. There were 6 departments that were supposed to administer tax incentives. 3 of the departments did not turn in any of their annual reports at all in one fiscal year. And that was either in 13 or 14. And in the other year, they turned in 87 or 89% of the reports that were due either weren't turned in at all or were turned in a manner that was totally insufficient for the auditors or anybody else to judge whether these tax incentives were actually achieving the desired result, which is job creation. Mm-hmm. So here you have corporate giveaways, corporate welfare, as Bobby Jindal himself put it, on Bobby Jindal's watch. In one year, almost 90% of the reports that were due on these incentives just not there.
And this was information that the legislature needed to make sound financial decisions.
Sure, of course. If you control the flow of information, you control the decision-making process. And that's what Bobby Jindal did. He controlled the flow of information by tightening the spigot on accurate information so that legislators said, well, this is what he told us, so that's what they did. It's like being on a board. If the board attorney gives you bad advice and you follow that advice, you're just following the advice. Well, the governor controlled that information, and his administration either lied about it or didn't put it out there accurately.
And then as he was running for president, you'd see him on these national talk shows, and he'd be talking about the Louisiana financial miracle and giving all these great figures about Louisiana.
It was all a charade. It was all a lie. And the voters in Iowa didn't fall for it. And it's amazing he still gets tapped to go appear on some of these shows like he's some kind of expert.
He was on, I think, just last night, actually, after the debate last night.
I don't understand why anybody in the national media thinks that Bobby Jindal matters one iota.
So to wrap up this segment really quickly, I know Newell Norman had some harsh words to say, but James Carville did too.
Yes, he did. I quoted him in my Gambit column this week, saying he said that given what has happened to universities and healthcare in the last 8 years under Bobby Jindal, all the cuts, and given what he's done with corporate welfare, someone should wrap the state capitol in crime scene tape. And he's right.
That's quite an image.
Because you know what? I think, and I said this in my column, somebody should compare the list of contributions to Bobby Jindal's gubernatorial and presidential campaign and correlate that with the list of companies and individuals associated with companies who got these massive tax incentives, and then see if there's any basis in law for some of those incentives. I'm told that in some cases, some big cases, there's actually no basis in law for some of those tax incentives.
More reporting, I would suppose, on this in the future. Thanks a lot, Clancy. Over to Katherine right now. And there has been some movement now in the Benson family feud on two fronts, Texas and here.
Yes. So this week, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeal issued a ruling that essentially leaves the competency ruling of Tom Benson in place. This is the ruling that found him mentally competent to continue to control and manage his own affairs. So this is the lawsuit that was filed by his estranged daughter and estranged grandchildren, Renee Benson and Rita and Ryan LeBlanc. They are claiming that Tom Benson is in mental decline and that he is being manipulated and controlled by his wife and some, like a circle of saints executives. So, but a New Orleans judge disagreed with that last year, found Tom Benson competent. The estranged heirs appealed. And so for now, Tom Benson remains in control of the teams. The heirs have an opportunity to appeal to the Louisiana Supreme Court. I'm told the lawyers hadn't made a decision earlier this week as to whether they'll do that.
Because the Fourth Circuit upheld the lower court's decision, so their next step would be perhaps going to the state Supreme Court.
Well, we heard 2 weeks ago that a deal was in the works, and that the thing encouraging, they're talking about, the whole Texas side was being settled. That kind of suggested to me, if they're settling Texas, then kind of implied in this is that they could be settling the other side, which is the teams. Mm-hmm. Was there not more to it? I mean, why did Tom Benson even agree to that if there wasn't anything for him?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, there's sort of 3 cases going on right now. This mental competency case has been working its way through the courts since Judge Reese's ruling last year. Then, as you mentioned, there was a case in Texas where Renee Benson was trying to have her father removed as trustee over this trust called the Shirley Benson Trust. It was created after Tom's first wife, Shirley Benson, passed away in 1980. That had been being litigated. Tom Benson was temporarily removed as trustee there, and then we found out a couple of weeks ago that Renee and Tom Benson had actually settled, and that settlement was that Renee Benson would immediately take over as trustee. There is also mediation in a 3rd case here in New Orleans that involves some non-controlling shares of the teams that are in trusts set up for Renee, Rita, and Ryan. Now you have to remember, Renee, Rita, and Ryan aren't actually a party to that lawsuit. This is a lawsuit between Tom Benson and the trustees over those trusts.
So none of it is uncomplicated. So that's still going on in federal court right now.
Yes, they had mediation in that case in January, and Tom Benson's attorney recently told me that he thinks that is progressing.
Okay, and meanwhile, also the heirs have gone to the state Supreme Court asking that some of the mental competency records be unsealed, too. And
Yes.
we haven't had a ruling on that yet.
That's right. There's not a ruling on that.
Okay, all right, thanks a lot. And we'll be hearing more about that down the line. Back to Clancy, and stuff is going on in the legislature right now to try to plug up this almost $1 billion hole just for the rest of this fiscal year. So what has the legislature done?
Well, this week, yesterday, the House, and of course all of the tax revenue raising measures and the budgets have to begin in the House. And the House is, because it's 105 members compared to the 39 members of the Senate, the House has always been, as long as I've been around, even a little longer than Bob's been here, I hate to say, the House is always a little more unruly because you get so many more personalities and more egos involved. It's been very difficult for the governor to muster the 70 votes, which is 2/3 of the 105-member House that's needed to pass a revenue-raising measure. The House did pass, after some extensive negotiations with the governor, they struck a compromise where they, first, the Democrats in the House, the governor being a Democrat, agreed to some additional cuts, some budget cuts that the Republicans wanted. And the Republicans have a majority. So the cuts bill that was sponsored by, I think, Cameron Henry, passed unanimously. And then immediately after that, they had enough votes, 76 votes, to pass a sales tax increase. This is the so-called fifth penny, and it was initially called a clean penny. It is not quite so clean anymore. And when they say clean, they meant a penny with no exemptions and exclusions. Big business, no surprise, which seems to always be in power no matter who the governor is. The Louisiana Association of Business and Industry insisted on some exemptions and exclusions for manufacturing machinery and equipment. That was put back in. So it doesn't raise quite as much money as the governor hoped it would. There's some discussion as to whether the fiscal note was deliberately kept low or lowballed. The fiscal note is an approximation by the House and Senate staff as to if you do pass this bill, if it's a tax or a budget cut or whatever, what fiscal impact will it have on the budget? In the case of a tax, the fiscal note is supposed to be a good faith approximation of how much money will be raised in a particular time period. And there's some suspicions that the fiscal notes were deliberately kept low, again, back to the controlling the flow of information, to get the House and Senate to pass maybe a little more in revenue, just in case they don't do enough. Who knows? That's all sorts of palace intrigue. But where we stand right now, the House passed the sales tax. They're sitting on all the other taxes: tobacco, alcohol, beer and wine. Not going anywhere with that. Today, they passed a few little housekeeping things, nothing major. And I think there's a cat and mouse game. The House wants to make sure that the Senate doesn't tinker with the sales tax bill, because that was a result of a very tenuous compromise. And I think they're waiting for the Senate to move that along, and then they'll maybe send over some other taxes. I'm sorry.
Doesn't the 5th Senate have a time limit on it, though?
It has an 18-month time limit. Interestingly enough, it's a good point, Errol. The governor initially wanted a 5-year sunset. I think he was never really locked into that. Then he retreated to a 3-year sunset, which would give the legislature time to do some real fiscal reform on a long-term basis. He settled for 18 months, I think, just to get it out of the House. But because that compromise was so delicate, I don't know that the Senate is going to tinker very much with that sales tax bill. In fact, the word going through the Senate Revenue and Fiscal Affairs Committee today by Walt Leger, who's a Democrat, leading Democrat in the House, was saying, look, don't mess with this, because it's a very tenuous compromise.
1 week left in the special session, and so this
week and a half now.
Okay, so and then this fiscal year deficit has to be plugged up by then.
Yes, $943 million. With the passage of the penny and the other measures, there were some cuts that the House made, some cuts that the governor made. If those go through, and with the use of the one-time BP money and the rainy day fund, they're still $200 million short.
Okay.
So something else has to come through.
We're facing some big problems still. Okay,
Yes.
Thanks a lot. Over to Katherine again. Uber. People are taking Uber rides.
Yes. So Uber arrived in New Orleans officially last April when the New Orleans City Council approved an ordinance regulating them and making them illegal. And so this week, Mayor Landrieu's office issued a report kind of updating everyone on how they say Uber is doing. And it was almost in defense of Uber. They're saying that Uber has increased the overall ridership rather than harming the taxi cab industry, who many of taxi cab drivers were opposed to Uber. Taxi cab drivers that I've talked to say we don't want Uber out necessarily, but we just want a fair playing field. You know, there are things that they have to go through that they say Uber doesn't have to go through: background checks, drug testing before they're allowed to get a license, and that they're not allowed to do surge pricing.
And of course, Uber says that their drivers do have background checks.
Yes.
Okay. Now, some of the taxi drivers here in New Orleans have sued some UberX drivers. What's going on with that?
So UberX is the low-cost service. That's kind of the Uber I think people think of. You call for a ride and someone in their Prius or someone in their pickup truck, come to pick you up. And so a group of taxi cab drivers actually took some Uber rides, recorded that, and filed a lawsuit against those Uber drivers saying, look, they picked me up for a fare and don't have a commercial driver's license, which is required, they say, under state law. So they're not actually suing Uber. They're seeking to sue UberX drivers as a class.
Okay.
But don't Uber drivers have to own their own vehicle and buy their own gas and take care of their own maintenance, whereas taxi drivers don't?
Yes, so Uber drivers are not employees of Uber. They are contract workers.
And so the status of that suit, and those drivers, the taxi drivers were seeking
a temporary injunction to stop those drivers from
operating?
Yes. Yeah. There's been a hearing on that motion a couple of times. It's been delayed, so I checked in today, and that still hasn't been rescheduled.
But isn't your reporting showing that at least Uber is serving parts of the area that aren't usually served by taxis?
Yeah, that's a good point. So the city's report said that Uber's getting into historically underserved neighborhoods with taxi cab drivers, so Algiers and eastern New Orleans, and also more of Uber's rides are originating outside of the CBD in the French Quarter.
Okay. All right, Katherine, thanks a lot. Errol, toss it to you, because I know you want to lead into this special
Well, we went in
segment.
the show talking about Bob Breck, and through the years, I think Bob's certainly been known for his his brilliance as a weather forecaster and his eloquence and his wit. I first remember him, I remember for all those three things, but when he first broke in, what comes to mind was his use of what was still new, the chroma key technology. And so he had this young weather forecaster, and they have these green screens on the back where you can project images. And like he'd be walking in suspended animation over the map of the United States or something. And you really was like, wow, look at that. And I thought that may have been how you first got attention as a weather forecaster. And then after a while, people got to know you. But I'm just curious about the evolution of your career.
Well, Errol, I don't know if you know who John Coleman is, but John Coleman started the Weather Channel, and he was one of my mentors in Chicago, and he had this set developed where you could walk into the map, pull out maps out of nowhere, and it would look like you're pulling the map out of space. And I had one of the Times-Picayune critics at the time said, I just wish that little guy would jump into Montana. Well, you know what? I could do that. And I did do that because that's what our set allowed. I just happened to position the map right by Montana. And back then we threw to a commercial break before the forecast, and I said, I'm going into Montana. And I jumped right into Montana. But that was back in the 80s when computers were just coming around. We still didn't have computers yet generating our graphics. They were all paper maps that had to be hand-drawn every day. And I used to have to put on this schmuck, I called it, to keep the chalk and the stuff that was making my map from getting on my clothes. And it was just a magical, fun time. The young kids that come up now, it's like they have no clue what we had to do back then when you didn't have the cell phones, you didn't have the communication systems. Marcia, you were talking about how we can warn people now ahead of time and how much warning we give them. Back then, sometimes we didn't know what was going on until we got the damage report. It was after the fact, and then the Weather Service would say, we got to get a warning out. So it's so more advanced now, and that it is an exciting time, but I know it's the time that I need to turn it over to the youngins.
And you're going to step down when? Wednesday?
This coming Wednesday will be my final broadcast.
That's just hard to believe,
on Fox
Bob.
8.
You just started, it seems.
They're doing an hour special. They're going to recap some of the zany stuff that we've done over the years. probably going back to the early days of chroma key. So I have not seen this yet, so I don't.
I want to see you go back to Montana, Bob.
I don't know if we have that, but that was quite a. Gambit just celebrated their 35th anniversary. I was telling Clancy ahead of time that he and I go back for the 35 years, because this is my 38th year, Guy. That. You were a young attorney, I think. I
wasn't even an attorney. I was
weren't
just
even
a young
an attorney
reporter.
yet.
That's right.
I know. We were in the newsroom together at WDSU, so
That's
we all
right.
kind of go back. It's hard to believe these years have gone by. You've been there at Fox 8 this entire time?
One station the whole time, and people have watched me. It's one thing, they've watched me grow old together, so they don't think of me as old. And they're wondering why I am retiring when it looks like I'm still having fun. And the simple answer is, at age 68, I've had a couple of health scares, and I just would like to do stuff with my wife, travel, fish, golf, garden, while I still have my faculties, because we all know what happens later in life. I think it was Katharine Hepburn said, getting old is not for sissies, so we're going to just go and have some fun.
Have some fun. You've earned every minute of it, and I know on behalf of all of us out there, just want to say thank you so much for keeping us all safe over all of these years.
It's been fun.
It's been great, and best of luck to you. All right, it is now time to look ahead, Errol.
2 more elections coming up really soon. Of course, next Saturday is the Louisiana primary. And then April 9th is going to be some municipal elections. And in New Orleans, there's the so-called public safety millage, which will be on the ballot.
Okay. Clancy.
Well, as Bob mentioned, Gambit is celebrating 35 years in print, and Errol and I go back there, as well as Bob and I go back a long ways. We've had a real fun time. This week's issue that just is out right now, our 35th anniversary issue, looks back and also looks forward. We're looking forward to the next 35 years, and we're going to have a little party this coming week with WWOZ, which is also 35 years old. So, as Bob mentioned, he and his viewers, went through the last 38 years together. We in WWOZ have been through the last 35 years together.
All right, Clancy, thanks. Congratulations, too. And to our next generation of media, right here, the youngster at the table, Katherine.
So next month, I'm looking forward to seeing what happens with some city-owned parking lots around the Piazza d'Italia. The city has a proposal to build to develop a Hard Rock hotel right there, and that has the potential to really transform that area. Okay. Bob?
I'm going home to watch TV. I haven't watched TV, so I'm going to go watch TV, which should be exciting, and do a couple of fun things.
They have color now.
Yeah.
They do? Oh, my goodness.
Best of luck again. Have a wonderful retirement. Thanks, you guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us, and we're going to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.